Chapter 7. Running with the Bulls. Crossed out. Pills. Running with the pills. While Future Perfect were great to work with, they indicated they weren't interested in repeating the event. So I needed to find the right promoter to grow this concept with. I tried another one of my clients, Kiss FM, for whom I put together a Valentine's cruise featuring breakfast show stars Street Boy and Dave, Matt Jam Lamont, Andy Morrison JC, and Squirrel, who were big at the time. The gender imbalance was a worry though. 75% blokes with most of the girls spoken for, so it turned into a lads' weekend. A roofer from Romford lost 1,700 quid in the casino before we'd even left the port. I remember thinking the wall-mounted breasts in the private video cabins were in for a busy few hours. The return crossing once again took place in a storm and turned a speed garage night into a line-dancing hoedown, sending girls wobbling along blue-carpeted corridors to their cabins to swap their glitzy heels for trainers. I asked everyone to fill in reaction sheets. One girl nailed it. "The concept's great, but all the men are minging." However, the Kiss Cruise reinforced my reputation with the ferry company as a professional and responsible safe pair of hands. This is always important to corporate entities who have their shareholders and brand reputation to worry about. I still had exclusivity on this, but word was getting out. My man in marketing was being called up by some big London promoters who'd heard about the first few club cruises. I knew they wouldn't want to work with Radical Escapes and that they definitely rubbed the Danish crew up the wrong way with their attitude and fuck it up for everyone. I just couldn't let that happen, having worked hard for very little return. Having survived dates in November and February, I appealed to the ferry company for one in the summer. And my persistence paid off when they said I could have an initial 500 beds in late June at 23 quid each, but on the condition I would commit to them up front. This meant if I didn't fill them, I'd still have to pay in full for them. Now, this was a big risk, 50,000 quid. But if I could find a crowd who were easygoing, looking for adventure, wanted to travel, and who were fiercely loyal to their promoters, I knew I was onto a winner. The concept was unique, and by the late 90s, London was the clubbing capital of the world. People went out 7 nights a week, and dance music ruled the charts. I just had to plug into the right crew. Through my freelance writing, I knew all the major promoters personally, and started attending their nights to suss out how their crowds behaved, how they dressed, and what they spent over the bar, all of which would tell me whether they'd be suitable. David and Alan, promoters of the legendary Torture Garden, had heard about the cruises and were keen to explore floating their fetishes, a prospect which shivered me timbers somewhat, conjuring up visions of cat and nine-tail floggings in the Columbus Lounge, keel-hauling sessions beneath the casino, and rubber sailor girls prowling the decks. As for what would take place on the onboard sauna, the mind boggled. I reluctantly shared my doubts. I don't think it will go down very well with the 50-odd lorry drivers who share the boat, not to mention the general public. I remember that last time there was a group of Belgian nuns on board. "Oh, you'd be surprised what those lorry drivers get up to in laybys and service station car parks," replied David. "Not to mention the nuns," added Alan with an eyebrow raised. "Or the general public, for that matter," David concluded. "We get all types at our parties, from forklift truck drivers and supermarket checkout girls to managing directors, celebrities, and 150 quid an hour lawyers." They were right, of course, but a TG crowd did what they did, feeling they were surrounded by like-minded people who had a stake in maintaining secrecy. A cross-channel ferry was public, not pubic transport. So we shook hands and parted, both parties realising that it wasn't to be. My search continued apace. On Monday morning, the ferry company gave me a week's deadline to send them the signed contract, or they'd unblock the beds and the golden opportunity of a June-July cruise would be lost, along with my exclusivity deal. Weekly weekend clubs like Freedom at Bagley's, who I handled press for, weren't interested because it didn't make sense losing their crowd. Other promoters were keen, but honest enough to tell me their crowd didn't drink anything other than tap water, or that their crew didn't own passports because they were so young and never been overseas. Another major London promoter initially told me he was interested, but told me his aspirational posy crowd would only book VIP Commodore cabins and not be seen dead slumming it in the standard ones. As we only had 12 Commodores, this wasn't feasible. There was always an obstacle. I needed a crew who weren't overtly sexual, spent well but weren't too obsessed with status, who were experienced enough to handle an afternoon in Hamburg after an all-night party and not lose their passports or sanity. Every day that week, the ferry company called me asking me to return the signed contract and pay the first 25% deposit on the cabins. This amounted to 12,500 quid, which I planned to borrow from my bank as a short-term loan. The bank agreed, but despite being a limited company, meaning I had limited liabilities, they demanded my house as a guarantee. This meant if it all went tits up, I would lose my house. I never told my wife Catherine this. Just like you, she's hearing about it for the first time. Sorry, babe. I was on the verge of giving up. The then free weekly magazine for Aussies living in London, TNT magazine, dropped on my mat. It was sent every week as I wrote their clubbing section. And amidst the Aussie rule results, an interview with a bald bloke from Midnight Oil and endless job adverts, I had a eureka moment. Of course! Aussies! I shouted out, startling Catherine as we sat in the kitchen table. She looked at me quizzically. The crowd I'm looking for is right beneath my nose. My Aussie, Kiwi and South African readers, trust me, just love travelling, and their club scene isn't dependent on costly big-name DJs. Distributed free at tube stations, TNT had a print run of 60,000, though in reality was read by over 100 to 150,000 pair of eyes due to it being left on the tube and picked up and passed around the overcrowded accommodation in which Antipodeans lived. Now, in the noughties, West London's Shepherd's Bush and its neighbouring boroughs Acton, Hammersmith, Fulham and Putney were Aussie enclaves. 30,000 of them on a rite of passage working holiday, using London as a base to hop around Europe while grafting and partying. The Aussie in London demographic changed radically in the 90s. Prior to the rave explosion early in the decade, Antipodeans arriving in the UK were content spending their time downing pints of Foster's in the walkabout or getting munted on snakebite to strippers while moshing to Jimmy Barnes in Sunday Swillfest to church. The highlight of their trip was the bucket list tour of Europe. A few months in a smelly van stopping off at Pamplona, Gallipoli, La Tomentina and Oktoberfest. The post-rave arrivals were aware London was the epicentre of the clubbing explosion and were eager, young enough and demographically organised to not only experience but create their own scene. Sure, they still wanted to run with the bulls in Pamps and throw tomatoes in Spain, but they were also open to exploring new frontiers and witnessing the new hedonism emerging from the planet's clubbing capital. I realised that these Aussies, Kiwis and South Africans were as interested in running with the pills as they were running with the bulls. All they needed was a boat big enough to accommodate them. Upon arriving in London, they were often bewildered as to where to begin their clubbing education. The choice was vast. By the mid-90s, the clubbing explosion was into its 7th year, and had split into a dizzying array of subgenres: funky house, glam house, hard house, handbag house, hardbag house, garage, speed garage, techno, trance, tech trance, drum and bass, and big beat. And that was just on a Tuesday. Dress codes were also creeping in as small boutique venues and promoters vied for the coolest crowd. After a few years of baggy tops and trousers, glow sticks and bum bags, glam was very much in. It was all a world away from the come-as-you-are ethos of the early years of rave culture. Attractive for those who had already experienced the first visceral throbs of rave, but not for the wave of Aussies and Kiwi virgin clubbers who sought an easily accessible soundtrack which they could enjoy in the few clothes they'd arrived with in their rucksacks. So, as they weren't catered for, they did what immigrants have done since the beginning of time. They created their own scene. Realising that after attending the church and other Sunday daytime clubs no one wanted to go home, Eamon Kilgraff and Wayne Hart hired a dingy basement of a West End pub and threw an unofficial after-party, which was still cracking on at 9 a.m. the next morning. The same 150 turned up each week, generating a family atmosphere. There was no dress code, attitude, or well-known superstar DJs. And it was free. The refurbishment of the pub meant they had to find another venue, a former London Underground branch tunnel behind the Astoria called The Tube, which involved paying a higher fee, so they had to start charging for admission and were concerned no one would pay to attend what was a previously free party. But they had the 3 elements every promoter needs to grow: trust, loyalty, and their own sound. I'd been part of the rave scene throughout the 90s and witnessed some hedonism, which cooled as the first generation of clubbers got older and more sensible. These southern scenesters may have joined the party late, but boy were they making up for it. They even turned going home into an extension of the party. There was no shortage of Aussie-rented large semi-detached houses with gardens, which were happy to host a party. One house party specialist like Macy Monroe was all it took to turn a quiet suburban Sunday afternoon in Acton into a full-on, neighbour-annoying, bass-pumping, arms-in-the-air, hard house-heaving rave. A decade after the tabloids had introduced the world to acid house, club culture was big business, with DJs asking for 5-figure sums. Club nights were now considered brands with registered logos, corporate entities who exploited multiple revenue streams, which included their own record label, mix CD series, a merchandise range, and overseas residences in Ibiza. The Down Underground scene, by comparison, was a decade behind, and still possessed an honourable not-for-profit passion to party, driven by a DIY punk spirit of making your own music and not playing by the rules. In 1997, Time Out asked me to write a feature about the scene after I told my editor, Dave Swindells, that the busiest nights in the capital featured DJs he'd never heard of. The feature alerted even bigger venues and British clubbers who weren't interested in glam house and garage nights. It was official. The Aussies and Kiwis were leading the charge. And they were certainly charged. This was a self-contained scene, a tight-knit clubbing community which stuck like glue with DJs who emerged from the scene itself, and promoters who loved to party. I knew all the main players, and more importantly, I got on with them all, as I had a direct line of communication through my column. I felt it was the ideal scene with which to throw the biggest international club crews to ever set sail from Old Blighty. Both Fever and Frantic were up for it, but there was a fierce rivalry between them, and so I brought in a third promoter, a gently spoken Irishman called Derek from Omnipotence, who weren't as big as Fever or Frantic, but he was well liked and respected in the scene and musically spot on. I felt his involvement would reduce potential friction between Fever and Frantic and give the event a bigger look. 3 promoters representing one scene, united on one huge boat, or an awesome Antipodean armada, as I described it in my column. I brought in John Del Borello as a partner. He worked for TNT and sorted a sweet deal on advertising, and with the most dynamic promoters in London fully firing, and a nice preview I wrote in TNT magazine, we'd sold out by 6 p.m. on launch day. 500 cabins filled. The ferry company had never seen anything like it. The next part was running over the ship's crew, whose officers were Danish with Thai service staff. Numerous ship's visits took place to establish what we could and couldn't do. It soon became obvious that the production had to be beefed up, so we brought in a huge 20k sound rig from Fearless Audio, who took it on as they liked to challenge, and because they said there's no work in Cornwall in April. No lasers were allowed, as other ships made mistake them for Morse distress codes, and strictly no pyros on the pool deck for the same reason. Dry ice wasn't allowed as it was a vision hazard in the event of an emergency. Despite these restrictions, Kevin still managed to put together the biggest lighting rig yet seen on a ship. He really pulled out all the stops, and his 3 crew, all good Cornish lads, only slept when we reached Hamburg. Now, strictly speaking, all mini cruise passengers had to disembark upon reaching Hamburg, but when the food and beverages manager reported the record-breaking night's take-ins, word came from the bridge that they were allowed to stay in their cabins and sleep all afternoon so they'd be able to work late the following night. Safety was our overriding concern. When you're taking 750 hedonistic clubbers on a boat for a 48-hour party, it's important to be prepared for all eventualities. So, in addition to the ship's own well-trained first aiders, we insisted on bringing our own medical team, including a GP. This was a significant extra cost as he was on duty all night. So that was the Friday and Saturday night sorted, but what the hell were we going to do in Hamburg for the 5 hours on Saturday afternoon? I'd told the promoters it was the German version of Amsterdam, seedy bars, a red light area, except with a Beatles museum. However, I managed to persuade the Thomas Reid Irish pub at the top of the Reeperbahn to open early, as I was bringing them 750 thirsty customers. They saved the day, preparing a buffet spread, pre-pulled pints of Guinness, and even set up some decks in one corner for our DJs. Result: Impact set sail from Harwich on the 2nd of July, bound for Hamburg. The sky was blue, and for once, the sea was thankfully calm. Due to the nature of the event, we were expecting strict searches from the customs guys on departure, but there was no more than usual, and the mood was very relaxed and welcoming. On this occasion, at least. As we didn't have the ship exclusively to ourselves, we had to fit in with the ship's existing entertainment programme. For anyone who dropped their pills in the queue for customs, this meant they came up whilst watching Billy the Balloon Twister create a dazzling array of animals. Things got even more surreal when the puppet show took to the stage. Goggle-eyed ravers at the front table were transfixed as a bloke dressed as a pirate joined them and produced a white rabbit hand puppet which proceeded to sing Barbie Girl. He then produced a huge hairy caterpillar from his jumper, which disappeared into thin air. When the ferry company mascot, a 6-foot blue and white parrot confusingly named Jack the Pirate, waddled in, handing out lollipops, it was all too much for one chemically enhanced seafarer who ran terrified from the Columbus Lounge, head in hands towards a lifetime of parrot PTSD. Then it was time for the ship's cabaret. A couple of leggy female dancers in sequined leotards, and someone I recognised as the entertainments officer in a top hat, tails and cane, deftly tap dancing his way through Putting on the Ritz. By now most of my crew were growing restless. They were here for hard house, not lame cabaret, and were primed to party. As we made up 90% of the audience in the Columbus Lounge, I persuaded the entertainments officer to cut short the cabaret before it ended in Jack the Pirate being keel-hauled and Balloon Man being revealed of his nitrous oxide canisters, which were the focus of ever-increasing interest. At 6 p.m, we opened the red velvet curtains which had been concealing the speaker stacks. A huge cheer went up as our first DJ started. There was no warm-up. It was a brutal, all-out hard house assault, from 0 to 60 in less than a minute. This caught a few members of the public who were still there, unaware, including an 80th birthday party group from Billericay and 2 tables of gingham shirts and cowboy boots heading to Germany for a line dancing convention. But both were up for the party, the oldies waving their hands to Spencer Freeland as they sat in their seats enjoying a glass of sherry, while the line dancers practiced their moves to DJ Misha and DJ Tim's throbbing anthem, Access. Everyone was smiling, no one judged, and everyone was welcome. Outside, floating on the calm ocean, oil and gas platforms glinted in the setting sun. The bars were doing a roaring trade. And as darkness fell, the coast of Belgium sparkled on the starboard bow like a distant constellation guiding us to a new world. By 2 a.m, the ship's officers were aware that this was unlike any party they'd ever witnessed. We draped all their glitter backdrops, turned off the mirror ball, and added some serious rave lighting and strobes. 2 huge stacks reached from the floor to the ceiling, tethered to the steel posts which supported the next deck to support them toppling over in the event of choppy seas. We placed the decks on a sea of duvets which rested on a mattress-like contraption we'd made specially for the occasion, but it was so calm we needn't have bothered. The first impact was a huge success, and word soon spread around London, and the ferry company inevitably had other promoters approach them. But my exclusivity deal meant that they were referred to Radical Escapes, and, after putting a lot of work into this, I wasn't going to let it be ruined by another crew I didn't know. So, we announced another impact in September, and once again had great weather. But the customs at Harwich appeared more interested, and when they found something on a few people, the mood changed. I was called to the chief purser's office and told that undercover customs officers were on board, and warned that if there was any evidence of drug taking, the customs at Hamburg would be alerted to give us a personal welcome. It's better to be a lion for a day than a sheep all your life, the words of Benito Mussolini. I kept my log from the night. 01:27 hours. Rumours of a passenger wearing our wristband, growling and crawling around the Blue Ribbon restaurant on all fours, sniffing around a family who were sat eating dinner. Go to Blue Ribbon and see an uncomfortable-looking family of Germans talking about Löw, but no sign of the growling sniffer. 01:32. Received call on radio from security. Guest on deck 6 is convinced he's a lion. Accompanied security and medical team to cabin from which roaring could be heard. Guest refused to take instruction to calm down, persisted crawling around and making growling and roaring noises. Despite being advised otherwise, insisted he was king of the jungle and threatened to smash the window and escape. Following numerous attempts to calm him, door was unlocked, he was forcibly restrained by Security A and Security B and given sedative by GP, who sat with him for the next few hours in his cabin. 02:30 hours. Called GP to check on sedated guest. Received the reply, no change in condition, sedation effective, the lion sleeps tonight.